Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. We have reached part 5 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Mr. Bedford and Mr. Cavor have reached the moon and seen its surface, and there is vegetation. Do they now dare leave their spacecraft and walk on the moon? It's time to pull up a chair, relax and enjoy part 5 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. 9. Prospecting begins. We ceased to gaze. We turned to each other, the same thought, the same question in our eyes. For these plants to grow, there must be some air, however attenuated, air that we also should be able to breathe. The manhole? I asked. Yes, said Cavor, if it is air we see. In a little while, I said, these plants will be as high as we are. Suppose after all, is it certain? How do you know that stuff is air? It may be nitrogen, it may be carbonic acid even. That's easy, he said, and set about proving it. He produced a big piece of crumpled paper from the bale, lit it and thrust it hastily through the manhole valve. I bent forward and peered down through the thick glass for its appearance outside, that little flame on whose evidence depended so much. I saw the paper drop out and lie lightly upon the snow. The pink flame of its burning vanished. For an instant it seemed to be extinguished, and then I saw a little blue tongue upon the edge of it that trembled and crept and spread. Quietly, the whole sheet, save where it lay in immediate contact with the snow, charred and shriveled and sent up a quivering thread of smoke. There was no doubt left to me. The atmosphere of the moon was either pure oxygen or air, and capable, therefore, unless its tenuity was excessive, of supporting our alien life. We might emerge and live. I sat down with my legs on either side of the manhole and prepared to unscrew it, but Cavor stopped me. There is first a little precaution, he said. He pointed out that, although it was certainly an oxygenated atmosphere outside, it might still be so rarefied as to cause us grave injury. He reminded me of mountain sickness and of the bleeding that often afflicts aeronauts who have ascended too quickly, and he spent some time in the preparation of a sickly-tasting drink, which he insisted on my sharing. It made me feel a little numb, but otherwise had no effect on me. Then he permitted me to begin unscrewing. Presently, the glass stopper of the manhole was so far undone that the denser air within our sphere began to escape along the thread of the screw, singing as a kettle sings before it boils. Thereupon he made me desist. It speedily became evident that the pressure outside was very much less than it was within. How much less it was, we had no means of telling. I sat grasping the stopper with both hands, ready to close it again if, in spite of our intense hope, the lunar atmosphere should, after all, prove too rarefied for us, and Cavor sat with a cylinder of compressed oxygen at hand to restore our pressure. We looked at one another in silence, and then at the fantastic vegetation that swayed and grew visibly and noiselessly without. And ever that shrill piping continued. My blood vessels began to throb in my ears, and the sound of Cavor's movements diminished. I noted how still everything had become because of the thinning of the air. As our air sizzled out from the screw, the moisture of it condensed in little puffs. Presently, I experienced a peculiar shortness of breath that lasted indeed during the whole of the time of our exposure to the moon's exterior atmosphere, and a rather unpleasant sensation about the ears and fingernails and the back of the throat grew upon my attention, and presently passed off again. But then came vertigo and nausea that abruptly changed the quality of my courage. I gave the lid of the manhole half a turn and made a hasty explanation to Cavor, but now he was the more sanguine. He asked me in a voice that seemed extraordinarily small and remote because of the thinness of the air that carried the sound. He recommended a nip of brandy, and set me the example, and presently I felt better. I turned the manhole stopper back again. The throbbing in my ears grew louder, and then I remarked that the piping note of the outrush had ceased. For a time I could not be sure that it had ceased. "Well?" said Cavor, in the ghost of a voice. "Well?" said I. "Shall we go on?" I thought, Is this all? If you can stand it." By way of answer, I went on unscrewing. I lifted the circular operculum from its place and laid it carefully on the bale. A flake or so of snow whirled and vanished as that thin and unfamiliar air took possession of our sphere. I knelt and then seated myself at the edge of the manhole, peering over it. Beneath, within a yard of my face, lay the untrodden snow of the moon. Then came a little pause. Our eyes met. "It doesn't distress your lungs too much?" said Cavor. "No," I said. "I can stand this." He stretched out his hand for his blanket, thrust his head through its central hole and wrapped it about him. He sat down on the edge of the manhole, let his feet drop until they were within 6 inches of the lunar ground. He hesitated for a moment, then thrust himself forward, dropped these intervening inches, and stood upon the untrodden soil of the moon. As he stepped forward, he was refracting grotesquely by the edge of the glass. He stood for a moment, looking this way and that. Then he drew himself together and leapt. The glass distorted everything, but it seemed to me even then to be an extremely big leap. He had at one bound become remote. He seemed 20 or 30 feet off. He was standing high upon a rocky mass and gesticulating back to me. Perhaps he was shouting, but the sound did not reach me. But how the deuce had he done this? I felt like a man who has just seen a new conjuring trick. In a puzzled state of mind, I too dropped through the manhole. I stood up. Just in front of me the snowdrift had fallen away and made a sort of ditch. I made a step and jumped. I found myself flying through the air, saw the rock on which he stood coming to meet me, clutched it and clung in a state of infinite amazement. I gasped a painful laugh. I was tremendously confused. Cavor bent down and shouted in piping tones for me to be careful. I had forgotten that on the moon, with only an 1/8 part of the Earth's mass and 1/4 of its diameter, my weight was barely 1/6 of what it was on Earth. But now that fact insisted on being remembered. "We are out of Mother Earth's leading strings now," he said. With a guarded effort, I raised myself to the top and, moving as cautiously as a rheumatic patient, stood up beside him in the blaze of the sun. The sphere lay behind us on its dwindling snowdrift 30 feet away. As far as the eye could see over the enormous disorder of rocks that formed the crater floor, the same bristling scrub that surrounded us was starting into life, diversified here and there by bulging masses of a cactus form and scarlet and purple lichens that grew so fast they seemed to crawl over the rocks. The whole area of the crater seemed to me then to be one similar wilderness up to the very foot of the surrounding cliff. The cliff was apparently bare of vegetation save at its base, and with buttresses and terraces and platforms that did not very greatly attract our attention at the time. It was many miles away from us in every direction. We seemed to be almost at the centre of the crater, and we saw it through a certain haziness that drove before the wind. For there was even a wind now in the thin air, a swift yet weak wind that chilled exceedingly but exerted little pressure. It was blowing round the crater, as it seemed, to the hot illuminated side from the foggy darkness under the sunward wall. It was difficult to look into this eastward fog. We had to peer with half-closed eyes beneath the shade of our hands because of the fierce intensity of the motionless sun. "It seems to be deserted," said Cavor. "Absolutely desolate." I looked about me again. I retained even then a clinging hope of some quasi-human evidence, some pinnacle of building, some house or engine, but everywhere one looked spread the tumbled rocks in peaks and crests and the darting scrub and those bulging cacti that swelled and swelled, a flat negation, as it seemed, of all such hope. "It looks as though these plants had it to themselves," I said. "I see no trace of any other creature." "No insects, no birds?" "No, not a trace, not a scrap nor particle of animal life. If there was, what would they do in the night? No, there's just these plants alone." I shaded my eyes with my hand. "It's like the landscape of a dream. These things are less like earthly land plants than the things one imagines among the rocks at the bottom of a sea. Look at that yonder. One might imagine it a lizard changed into a plant. And the glare!" "This is only the fresh morning," said Cavor. He sighed and looked about him. This is no world for men, he said, and yet in a way it appeals. He became silent for a time, then commenced his meditative humming. I started at a gentle touch and found a thin sheet of livid lichen lapped over my shoe. I kicked at it, and it fell into powder, and each speck began to grow. I heard Cavor exclaim sharply, and perceived that one of the fixed bayonets of the scrub had pricked him. He hesitated. His eyes sought among the rocks about us. A sudden blaze of pink had crept up a ragged pillar of crag. It was a most extraordinary pink, a livid magenta. "Look," said I, turning, and behold, Cavor had vanished. For an instant I stood transfixed. Then I made a hasty step to look over the verge of the rock, but in my surprise at his disappearance I forgot once more that we were on the moon. The thrust of my foot that I made in striding would have carried me a yard on earth, but on the moon it carried me 6, a good 5 yards over the edge. For the moment the thing had something of the effect of those nightmares where one falls and falls. For while one falls 16 feet in the first second of a fall on earth, on the moon one falls 2, and with only a sixth of one's weight. I fell, or rather jumped, down about 10 yards, I suppose. It seemed to take quite a long time, 5 or 6 seconds, I should think. I floated through the air and fell like a feather, knee-deep in a snowdrift at the bottom of a gully of blue-grey, white-veined rock. I looked about me. "Cavor!" I cried, but no Cavor was visible. "Cavor!" I cried louder, and the rocks echoed me. I turned fiercely to the rocks and clambered to the summit of them. "Cavor!" I cried. My voice sounded like the voice of a lost lamb. The sphere, too, was not in sight, and for a moment a horrible feeling of desolation pinched my heart. Then I saw him. He was laughing and gesticulating to attract my attention. He was on a bare patch of rock 20 or 30 yards away. I could not hear his voice, but "jump," said his gestures. I hesitated. The distance seemed enormous, yet I reflected that surely I must be able to clear a greater distance than Cavor. I made a step back, gathered myself together, and leapt with all my might. I seemed to shoot right up in the air as though I should never come down. It was horrible and delightful and as wild as a nightmare to go flying off in this fashion. I realised my leap had been altogether too violent. I flew clean over Cavor's head and beheld a spiky confusion in the gully spreading to meet my fall. I gave a yelp of alarm. I put out my hands and straightened my legs. I hit a huge fungoid bulk that burst all around me, scattering a mass of orange spores in every direction and covering me with orange powder. I rolled over, spluttering, and came to rest, convulsed with breathless laughter. I became aware of Cavor's little round face peering over a bristling hedge. He shouted some faded inquiry. "Eh?" I tried to shout, but I could not do so for want of breath. He made his way towards me, coming gingerly among the bushes. "We've got to be careful," he said. "This moon has no discipline. She'll let us smash ourselves." He helped me to my feet. "You exerted yourself too much," he said, dabbing at the yellow stuff with his hand to remove it from my garments. I stood, passive and panting, allowing him to beat off the jelly from my knees and elbows and lecture me upon my misfortunes. "We don't quite allow for the gravitation. Our muscles are scarcely educated yet. We must practice a little when you've got your breath." I pulled 2 or 3 little thorns out of my hand and sat for a time on a boulder of rock. My muscles were quivering, and I had that feeling of personal disillusionment that comes at the first fall to the learner of cycling on earth. It suddenly occurred to Cavor that the cold air in the gully, after the brightness of the sun, might give me a fever, so we clambered back into the sunlight. We found that beyond a few abrasions I had received no serious injuries from my tumble, and at Cavor's suggestion we were presently looking round for some safe and easy landing place for my next leap. We chose a rocky slab some 10 yards off, separated from us by a little thicket of olive-green spikes. "Imagine it there," said Cavor, who was assuming the air of a trainer as he pointed to a spot about 4 feet from my toes. This leap I managed without difficulty, and I must confess I felt a certain satisfaction in Cavor's falling short by a foot or so and tasting the spikes of the scrub. "One has to be careful, you see," he said, pulling out his thorns, and with that he ceased to be my mentor and became my fellow learner in the art of lunar locomotion. We chose a still easier jump and did it without difficulty, and then leapt back again, and to and fro several times, accustoming our muscles to the new standard. I could never have believed, had I not experienced it, how rapid that adaptation would be. In a very little time indeed, certainly after fewer than 30 leaps, we could judge the effort necessary for a distance of almost terrestrial assurance. And all this time, the lunar plants were growing around us, higher and denser and more entangled, every moment thicker and taller, spiked plants, green cactus masses, fungi, fleshy and lichenous things, strangest radiate and sinuous shapes. But we were so intent upon our leaping that for a time we gave no heed to their unfaltering expansion. An extraordinary elation had taken possession of us. Partly, I think, it was our sense of release from the confinement of the sphere. Mainly, however, the thin sweetness of the air, which I am certain contained a much larger proportion of oxygen than our terrestrial atmosphere. In spite of the strange quality of all about us, I felt as adventurous and experimental as a cockney would do, placed for the first time among mountains, and I do not think it occurred to either of us, face to face though we were with the unknown, to be very greatly afraid. We were bitten by a spirit of enterprise. We selected an area perhaps 15 yards away and landed neatly on its summit, one after the other. "Good!" we cried to each other. "Good!" And Cavor made 3 steps and went off to a tempting slope of snow a good 20 yards and more beyond. I stood for a moment, struck by the grotesque effect of his soaring figure, his dirty cricket cap and spiky hair, his little round body, his arms and his knickerbockered legs tucked up tightly, against the weird spaciousness of the lunar scene. A gust of laughter seized me, and I stepped off to follow. Plump, I dropped beside him. We made a few gargantuan strides, leapt 3 or 4 more times about, and sat down at last in the lichenous hollow. Our lungs were painful. We sat holding our sides and recovering our breath, looking appreciation to one another. Cavor panted something about amazing sensations. And then a thought came into my head. For a moment it did not seem a particularly appalling thought, simply a natural question arriving out of the situation. "By the way," I said, "where exactly is the sphere?" Cavor looked at me. "Eh?" The full meaning of what we were saying struck me sharply. "Cavor," I cried, laying a hand on his arm, "where is the sphere?" 10. Lost Men in the Moon. His face caught something of my dismay. He stood up and stared about him at the scrub that fenced us in and rose about us, straining upward in a passion of growth. He put a dubious hand to his lips. He spoke with a sudden lack of assurance. "I think," he said slowly, "we left it somewhere about there." He pointed a hesitating finger that wavered in an arc. "I'm not sure." His look of consternation deepened. "Anyhow," he said with his eyes on me, "it can't be far." We had both stood up. We made unmeaning ejaculations. Our eyes sought in the twining, thickening jungle around us. All about us on the sunlit slopes frothed and swayed the darting shrubs, the swelling cactus, the creeping lichens, and wherever the shade remained, the snowdrifts lingered. North, south, east, and west spread an identical monotony of unfamiliar forms, and somewhere, buried already among this tangled confusion, was our sphere, our home, our only provision, our only hope of escape from this fantastic wilderness of ephemeral growths into which we had come. "I think after all," he said, pointing suddenly, "it might be over there." "No," I said, "we have turned in a curve. See, here is the mark of my heels. It's clear the thing must be more to the eastward, much more. No, the sphere must be over there." "I think," said Cavor, "I kept the sun on my right all the time." "Every leap, it seems to me," I said, "my shadow flew before me." We stared into one another's eyes. The area of the crater had become enormously vast to our imaginations, the growing thickets already impenetrably dense. "Good heavens! What fools we have been!" "It's evident that we must find it again," said Cavor, "and that soon. The sun grows stronger. We should be fainting with the heat already if it wasn't so dry, and I'm hungry." I stared at him. I had not suspected this aspect of the matter before, but it came to me at once, a positive craving. "Yes," I said with emphasis, "I am hungry too." He stood up with a look of active resolution. "Certainly, we must find the sphere." As calmly as possible, we surveyed the interminable reefs and thickets that formed the floor of the crater, each of us weighing in silence the chances of our finding the sphere before we were overtaken by heat and hunger. "It can't be 50 yards from here," said Cavor with an indecisive gesture. "The only thing is to beat around about it until we come upon it." "That is all we can do," I said without any alacrity to begin our hunt. "I wish this confounded spike bush did not grow so fast." "That's just it," said Cavor. "But it was lying on a bank of snow." I stared about me in the vain hope of recognizing some knoll or shrub that had been near the sphere, but everywhere was a confusing sameness. Everywhere the aspiring bushes, the distending fungi, the dwindling snowbanks steadily and inevitably changed. The sun scorched and stung, the faintness of an unaccountable hunger mingled with our infinite perplexity. And even as we stood there, confused and lost amidst unprecedented things, we became aware for the first time of a sound upon the moon other than the air of the growing plants, the faint sighing of the wind, or those we had made ourselves. Boom, boom, boom. It came from beneath our feet, a sound in the earth. We seemed to hear it with our feet as much as with our ears. Its dull resonance was muffled by distance, thick with the quality of intervening substance. No sound that I can imagine could have astonished us more, or have changed more completely the quality of things about us, for this sound, rich, slow, and deliberate, seemed to us as though it could be nothing but the striking of some gigantic buried clock. Boom, boom, boom. Sounds suggestive of still cloisters, of sleepless nights in crowded cities, of vigils and the awaited hour, of all that is orderly and methodical in life, booming out pregnant and mysterious in this fantastic desert. To the eye, everything was changed. The desolation of bushes and cacti waving silently in the wind stretched unbroken to the distant cliffs. The still dark sky was empty overhead, and the hot sun hung and burned. And through it all, a warning, a threat, throbbed this enigma of sound. Boom, boom, boom. We questioned one another in faint and faded voices. "A clock? Like a clock? What is it? What can it be?" "Count," was Cavor's belated suggestion, and at that word the striking ceased. The silence, the rhythmic disappointment of the silence, came as a fresh shock. For a moment one could doubt whether one had even heard a sound, or whether it might not still be going on. Had I, indeed, heard a sound? I felt the pressure of Cavor's hand upon my arm. He spoke in an undertone as though he feared to wake some sleeping things. "Let us keep together," he whispered, "and look for the sphere. We must get back to the sphere. This is beyond our understanding." "Which way should we go?" He hesitated. An intense persuasion of presences, of unseen things about us and near us, dominated our minds. What could they be? Where could they be? Was this arid desolation, alternately frozen and scorched, only the outer rind and mask of some subterranean world? And if so, what sort of world? What sort of inhabitants might it not presently disgorge upon us? And then, stabbing the aching stillness as vivid and sudden as an unexpected thunderclap, came a clang and rattle as though great gates of metal had suddenly been flung apart. It arrested our steps. We stood gaping helplessly. Then Cavor stole towards me. "I do not understand," he whispered close to my face. He waved his hand vaguely skyward, the vague suggestion of still vaguer thoughts. "A hiding place. If anything came—" I looked about us. I nodded my head in assent to him. We started off, moving stealthily with the most exaggerated precautions against noise. We went towards a thicket of scrub. A clangour like hammers flung about a boiler hastened our steps. "We must crawl," whispered Cavor. The lower leaves of the bayonet plants, already overshadowed by the newer ones above, were beginning to wilt and shrivel so that we could thrust our way in among the thickening stems without serious injury. A stab in the face or arm we did not need. At the heart of the thicket, I stopped and stared, panting, into Cavor's face. "Subterranean," he whispered. "Below." "They may come out? We must find the sphere." "Yes," I said, "but how?" "Crawl till we come to it." "But if we don't?" "Keep hidden. See what they are like." "We will keep together," said I. He thought, "Which way shall we go?" "We must take our chance." We peered this way and that. Then, very circumspectly, we began to crawl through the lower jungle, making, so far as we could judge, a circuit, halting now at every waving fungus, at every sound, intent only on the sphere from which we had so foolishly emerged. Ever and again, from out of the earth beneath us, came concussions, beatings, strange, inexplicable, mechanical sounds, and once, and then again, we thought we heard something, a faint rattle and tumult, borne to us through the air. But fearful as we were, we dared essay no vantage point to survey the crater. For long we saw nothing of the beings whose sounds were so abundant and insistent. But for the faintness of our hunger and the drying of our throats, that crawling would have had the quality of a very vivid dream. It was so absolutely unreal. The only element with any touch of reality was these sounds. Picture it to yourself. About us, the dreamlike jungle, with the silent bayonet leaves darting overhead, and the silent, vivid, sun-splashed lichens under our hands and knees, waving with the vigour of their growth as a carpet waves when the wind gets beneath it. Ever and again, one of the bladder fungi, bulging and distending under the sun, loomed over us. Ever and again, some novel shape in vivid colour obtruded. The very cells that built up these plants were as large as my thumb, like beads of coloured glass. And all these things were saturated in the unmitigated glare of the sun, were seen against a sky that was bluish-black and spangled still, in spite of the sunlight, with a few surviving stars. Strange! The very forms and texture of the stones were strange. It was all strange. The feeling of one's body was unprecedented. Every other movement ended in surprise. The breath sucked thin in one's throat. The blood flowed through one's ears in a throbbing tide. Thud, 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 and ever and again came gusts of turmoil, hammering, the clanging and throb of machinery, and presently the bellowing of great beasts. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 5 of The First Men in the Moon. If you'd like to support The Well Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with part 6 of the story. I hope you can join me.